It's
Okay,
on.
we're hot.
It's on.
Dawn? So thank you all for coming. Welcome to the Collaborative Community Radio Show here on KGNU Boulder, Denver. And I'd like to thank you for
I haven't hit recording it, so.
Okay. All right, you ready?
You have to repeat
You
it.
don't have to like.
Yeah, you can't edit. The editors they can't edit stuff in that wasn't there.
Are you sure?
Everybody has to like, you know.
Okay. All right, you good? All right. Welcome to the Collaborative Community Radio Show with KGNU Boulder, Denver. And tonight we are pleased to have a conversation that is co-sponsored by the Boulder Coalition and Alliance on Race. So I'd like to thank Jen Watson and Reverend Dr. Don Matthews for co-hosting this event and for the space here at First Congregational Church. And thank you to our live audience who is here to participate in this conversation and to really generate a community dialogue around this crucial issue. To serve and protect who. That's the title, but as I think you'll hear in the conversation, it goes a little broader than that. But want to introduce our panelists this evening, and I'm going to start with Darren O'Connor. And Darren is a local Boulder and Denver activist who works with Radically Compassionate Justice and the Boulder Rights Watch group, and has really been, I'd like to say thank you to Darren too, because he's really been the key leader in pulling together this conversation this evening. So I really want to let Darren introduce himself more fully and just tell us a little bit more about Darren. What is your personal journey? What events or experiences have led you to this conversation that we're having tonight? And then just share a little bit, maybe more of a framing view of this topic.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, so I'm from Boulder, but I've done a lot of activism in Denver. I got started with Occupy Denver and the Colorado Foreclosure Resistance Coalition, a group that seeks to keep people in their homes when they're being foreclosed on, specifically when they're being foreclosed on by fraudulent banks who are using paperwork that really doesn't acknowledge the efforts they have made to stay in their homes legally. Often we see people who have made their payments and yet they still end up getting foreclosed on under a default because banks can say whatever banks want to. So in doing that work, as I said, I've done a lot of work with Occupy Denver. We're on the streets, we're at people's homes, and that ends up having a lot of interface, unfortunately, with the police, who are ultimately the ones who show up and remove people from their homes. So I'm going to talk a little bit more later on about some of the other volunteer work and activism I do. But I wanted to open with a quote by John F. Kennedy. It's a little ironic since he was brutally murdered, but those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. And on that note, I also want to share with you that we did invite the Denver Police Protective Association to this discussion, but they did not respond. And I specifically chose them because they've been involved in advocating for a lot more brutal response to activists on the streets who are advocating for reform or complete change to the justice and policing system. So we're here because racial profiling, police brutality, and police killings, especially of people of color, have become, sadly, daily news. And we're here because every 28 hours an African American is killed in this country by the police. And we're here because of people like 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was shot less than 2 seconds after police officers arrived on a call in which they were warned that he had what was most likely a BB gun in his possession. You know, they pulled up, you can watch the video, jumped out of the car and shot him, and then tackled his 14-year-old sister as she ran to him, trying to see if he was okay. So that was in, I believe, Cleveland, Ohio. But here in Denver, the Denver police were recently reported to be the second most lethal police force in the country, and Boulder was recently also reported to be the second worst police force in the state for racial profiling. So we have problems here that are also being seen nationally. So in my volunteer work, every kind, I end up interfacing with police in a way that has astounded me, and I think would astound most people. My background, I volunteered with Boulder Outreach for Homeless Overflow, advocating for and helping people who are currently homeless. As I mentioned earlier, the Colorado Foreclosure Resistance Coalition and Occupy Denver, Denver Homeless Out Loud, another advocate for homeless folks, Boulder Rights Watch, Boulder Cop Watch, and Radically Compassionate Justice, and finally the co-sponsored Boulder Coalition and Alliance on Race. In just about every one of those, I have had interfaces with the police that didn't go so well. One of those included a SWAT team takedown during a foreclosure eviction resistance of a 63-year-old grandmother. At that event, we went to the Idaho Springs Sheriff's Office to try and talk with the sheriff of that community to try and get a delay on that foreclosure because she was working on legal means to stay in her home, and they refused to meet with us. They refused to talk to us, and instead, while I was live streaming, I live streamed a video of someone with a air gun, a BB gun, and in subsequent interviews, the police and the SWAT team said that they came because there was a handgun on site. They never found the handgun. They never really looked for a handgun. It was just an excuse. And Sahara, again, a 63-year-old grandmother, had an AR-15 rifle pointed at her. There were about 20 SWAT team members, AR-15 rifles, flash grenades, and I don't know what else they were carrying. But they burst through the door. She was in her kitchen and pointed their guns at her. And when she told one of the officers in her kitchen to stop pointing that at her, he did stop pointing it at her, and then he rushed her, picked her up, and threw her to the ground and arrested her. Here in Boulder, with Boulder Rights Watch, I met a woman who was choked at the RTD bus station by one of the managers. And this woman is all of about 100 pounds. She was choked, taken to the ground, and the police came, and one might think they would have defended her right to be there. She was waiting for a bus, but she looked to be possibly homeless, so she lost all her rights. She's a member of a very at-risk community. And now she's working, last I knew, on plea bargaining her way out of getting choked and removed by the officers. So those are the kind of things that I have seen far too much of. And I just want to share a little bit of what that sounds like, because it's really quite traumatizing and frightening to experience these things. Yeah, so that was 20 SWAT officers arriving with a peaceful group of people willing to take an arrest to get attention to the fact that we're throwing people out of their homes who are legally challenging what the banks are saying. And in all of these activities, there's an interaction between police that has informed me of what I now see as fact, that the police are, when it matters, an army of the rich. Just 3 weeks ago, Chief Testa confirmed the characterization of the police as an army when he stated to community members at the Human Relations Commission that the police are like a paramilitary organization. And this is true, as police are increasingly armed with weapons through the 1033 program that has transferred $5.1 billion in excess military equipment to police departments, including school police departments. It's hard to see how we have not violated the Posse Comitatus Act, which states it shall not be lawful to employ any part of the army for purpose of executing the laws. Certainly, employing military-grade weapons in the hands of police seems exceedingly questionable. Law enforcement, be it the police or drug enforcement agencies, are far more often deployed against people of color, our unhoused neighbors, the homeless, or even paid by banks to expedite a foreclosure eviction, such as you just heard. SWAT team deployments have increased to an estimated 40,000 a year. You know, that's over 100 a day, a couple a day per state if we average that out. And 62% of those are for drug raids, and between 36 and 65% turn up no contraband. The ACLU found a majority, 37% of SWAT raids are against African Americans, while only 19% are against whites. Given we know drugs are used at similar rates across race and socioeconomic lines, then we also know that our law enforcement is being deployed with a racial bias. Recently, DEA agent Matthew Fogg came out saying that he shared with his superiors that statistics show they use more drugs out in those areas. He was talking about rich and white communities than anywhere. Fogg goes on to say, the special agent in charge says to me, you know, if we go out there and start messing with those folks, they know judges, they know lawyers, they know politicians. You start locking their kids up, somebody's going to jerk our chain. He said they're going to call us on it, and before you know it, they're going to shut us down, and there goes your overtime. Amazing. So, a recent focus on police abuse has brought forth the familiar argument that it is only a few bad apples that are making the police look bad. But the ACLU has come out with a report that undermines this assertion, giving examples where on the order of 10 officers were involved in abusive arrests and covered for one another. And you're going to hear next from Alex Landau, who had several officers who all, in my opinion, broke the law and abused his rights because they could. It's not just a few bad apples. It's a systemic problem. The systemic problem with cops getting away with these abuses, such as the Denver DA, which has not indicted a cop in 23 years, not since 1992. In that time, the Denver PD has risen to what was reported this year as the second most lethal force in the country. During the 2008 convention, they even went so far as to print shirts and give them to police union members, thousands of them, that said, we get up early to beat the crowds. That's the kind of humor, that's the kind of mindset that is accepted and promoted within the Denver Police Protective Association. Bringing it home to Boulder, our community and our police have to take that first step and admit that we have a racial bias problem. African American residents that I consider very brave for doing so have been coming forward to share the consistent aggressions they experience here, and not just by law enforcement, but law enforcement also obviously has a problem. At a recent march in Boulder streets to raise awareness of the 5 times arrest rate of blacks, the police arrested 2 men, both of color, despite a well-documented escalation between police and marchers in which plenty of white people in the crowd were thrown to the ground and could have earned the overused interfering with a police officer charge. When confronted with not arresting any white people, Boulder Police Chief Testa stated to me, "Good for us for not going back and investigating and charging them with a felony. Good for us for not arresting the white people." The irony was lost on Chief Testa that he was expressing outright that racial profiling had taken place, and the Boulder police should be commended for it, evidently. So given this level of denial from police leaders, we can expect no positive change, in my opinion, by simply asking them to be kinder and gentler when they are acting as the army of the rich. We need fundamental change to a system in which, for example, slavery is still legal by the 13th Amendment as punishment for a crime. I encourage you to read that. Here in Boulder, citizens have engaged City Council to ask that our African American community and other at-risk communities have access to some sort of citizen oversight panel that they can petition with grievances against the police. While the Boulder District Attorney recently promoted how good it is that he pushes for jury trials as a very fair process, it has been shown that 95% of cases are resolved in plea bargain, where fearful or resourceless defendants accept a lesser charge in order to avoid a long legal battle and risking being found guilty of worse charges and longer sentences. All of us, but our at-risk populations of homeless and people of color especially, would greatly benefit from a non-judicial process by which to address the biased and unfair treatment that simple statistics show is occurring in Boulder. Police do need improved training. In Richmond, California, police practice frequently how to deal with dangerous threats through role-playing. We need our police to be less frightened in their jobs, as currently 50% of those killed by the police have mental health issues. To our officers, I say, please, please train to use non-lethal responses, such as has been done in Richmond, where no cops or citizens have been shot since they implemented non-lethal response training in 2008. Finally, I want to encourage people to think very hard about whether they really need a cop to solve a problem. I ask that you consider, does this problem with my neighbor or my angry family member or this homeless person I feel bothered by, does this problem really warrant asking someone armed with a gun to help solve it? Can you not call a friend and ask for help instead? You know, I've been to some of the community engagements with the police who have shared that we do call them too often. We do want them to solve too many of our problems. And since then, I'll just share a quick story that I had trouble with a neighbor who was playing his music too loud, and the advice I got was call the police. And doing the work I do, I felt that that was the last thing I wanted to do. So I did the uncomfortable thing, which was go talk to him, and go talk to him, and go talk to him until we resolved it. And now, you know, I communicate with him on a friendly basis, and we figured out a way to deal with that. But I could have called the police, and he probably broke the sound ordinance, and I could have used the justice system to make it painful for him. We don't need to do that. We can act as community. Thank you.
So just a reminder for our listeners, you're listening to KGNU Radio, Boulder, Denver. And this is the Collaborative Community Radio Show. I'm your host, Ken Miller, and you've been listening to Darren O'Connor, an activist here in Boulder and in Denver with Radically Compassionate Justice and the Boulder Rights Watch. And Darren mentioned Alex Landau, who's going to be our next presenter, who's connected with the Colorado Progressive Coalition. And Alex is both an activist and a survivor of police abuse. And so Alex, share with us a little bit of your broader background and experience and just your own personal journey and how that's led you to this conversation.
Certainly. First of all, thank you. I'm happy to be here. My personal story, my narrative, begins when I was adopted at 2 days old. I'm a domestic adoptee. My parents are both white. And I spent a good majority of my childhood in small, rural, predominantly white communities, Conifer, Bailey. I graduated from Collegiate Academy, which is a alternative charter school on Kipling and C470. My mom comes from Americus, Georgia, and being caught in this Southern mentality, growing up with that sort of influence. She grew up post-civil rights movement. She can tell me stories of segregated bathrooms, segregated schools, not being able to go to the black parts of town, and the black folks not being able to come into her neighborhood, KKK, etc. My dad, he comes from a law enforcement background. My grandfather, his dad, and my great-grandfather, his grandfather, were both Denver police officers, of all things. This was right around the beginning of the department, the first beat cops to ever walk the city and county of Denver. So they met here in Colorado. My mom broke the chain. She didn't want to conform to this Southern mentality that a good majority of her family members had been subjected to live to. And so she went to Michigan for school, then she went to Texas and landed in Denver, met my dad, who also broke the chain. Didn't want to become a law enforcement officer. He wanted to do environmental engineering. So they both kind of revolted against the historical in-home trend. And they adopted myself and my sister. I have another sister. We're not biological, but we both come from African-American background. and they adopted her when I was 4. So she's 4 years younger than me. In turn, this also contributed to the identity that we were led to believe, and that we kind of molded our opinions and shaped our realities around. And that did not include what racial profiling looked like. That did not include disparities between communities of color and police, and the best way to navigate interactions with law enforcement to the best possible outcomes. I love my parents, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't have it any other way. I wouldn't go back and do it again if I could. And I think that since my interaction, my extreme interaction with Denver police has created a great awakening in our, not just in our family, but it's also brought us closer together as a unit. We've had to overcome many obstacles since then. So again, just touching on the background, there was never that comfortable conversation in the home. I can actually remember my first racial interaction happened when I was 4 years old behind West Jeff Middle School. And it was a child about my age, 4 or 5, and I don't even remember what the dispute was, but I can think back to a comment that he said in retaliation, and he said, sometimes not all white kids like to play with black kids. And I didn't know exactly what that meant. I didn't have an understanding of the gravity of the comment, but I knew it hurt. I knew that my skin was something I couldn't change, and that just didn't seem fair that you would attack me that way. And I remember my mom coming over and grabbing this kid and kicking him out of the public park. But I also think that child didn't have an understanding of what he was saying. That individual child was being, he was just relaying information that was being passed on in his household. I mean, at that age, who could really have an understanding of such negativity? And so I finally completed high school. I was the only graduating black male in my high school class. There were 4 in my entire high school experience, including myself. So I'm finally out of school. I've graduated. I'm on my own. I'm working a couple of jobs. I'm paying my own rent. I immediately dove into college at CCD, and I purchased my own car. I'm driving an '84 Lincoln Town Car. And if you're familiar with that car, it's a big old boat-style vehicle. Some people might say it looks like a mobster's car, something you might see on The Godfather, for example. Profilable, to say the least. So I remember, picking up a friend of mine late night. It was roughly 1 in the morning, 12:45 in the morning. And he lived on Colfax and Tamarack at the time. I was on Colfax and Potomac, which is further east, so it was on my way home. I wasn't concerned. And we were pulled over on Colfax and Emerson. We were going to stop at the Wendy's. We overshot the Wendy's on Emerson. We were going to turn around on 16th Street. And we were never able to do that. We were pulled over by Ricky Nixon, and I don't know if you're familiar with 16th and Emerson, but it's a very quiet neighborhood. The 24-hour business that goes on Colfax doesn't tend to spill over into this part of the area. So there's a bunch of Victorian homes that have been renovated into law offices, rehabilitation, treatment centers, and things like that. There's nothing that was active at 12:30, 12:45 in the morning. And we were pulled over on the side of the road, and he comes to the car and he asks if I know why I'm being pulled over. And I tell him, no, I don't. I have no idea. And he says that I made an illegal left turn coming from Colfax. And at the time, I'm sitting there thinking, maybe I did. There were a lot of no left turn signs on Colfax, and perhaps I didn't see it and made an illegal left turn. So this kind of transpired into, let me see your license, registration, proof of insurance, the typical spiel that an officer would give you. I dove out of the house in a hurry that morning and realized I left my wallet at the house. I didn't have an ID. However, my license was valid, and I articulated this to the officer, and I offered my social security number as an alternative. My registration was up to date, my insurance was up to date, no warrants, clean traffic history, all of that. And then he goes around and does the same thing to my passenger, gets his ID, and then goes back to his squad car. And there was this uncomfortable silence. It felt like it was only a few minutes, but just the energy felt wrong. Something felt out of place. And he comes back to the vehicle and he says, I want you to get out of the car because I can detect an aroma of marijuana coming from within the vehicle. And this again, not knowing my rights, not having an understanding of the reality and the extent of racial profiling and what that can lead to and what that can look like. At this point, I'm just digging up things that I had been taught over the years. I told the officer I'd like to see a warrant, and without any reply, again, I was told to get out of the car, so I got out of the car. I didn't know what else to do. I was pat down. They didn't find anything on me, and they told me to go stand behind my vehicle in front of his squad car. There was probably a 7-foot gap between my bumper and his bumper. And then he went around to my passenger and did the same thing, yanked him out of the car. And before he even got a chance to pat him down, my passenger had a pill container full of weed in his breast pocket. And he just gave it to the officer. You know, he wasn't trying to hide it, he was very forward about it. And he was placed in handcuffs and told to go sit by where I was standing. And when that happened, another squad car arrived on the scene, and Officer Randy Murr and Officer Tiffany Middleton approached Ricky Nixon at my car. They're pointing at us, they're pointing at the area, they're pointing at my vehicle, and my ignorance at the time, my lack of knowledge around the subject matter, I'm sitting here thinking that there are 3 officers here, I've just been patted down, they know I'm not dangerous and I have no weapons on my person. I'm 19 years old, I should be able to have a conversation with these officers like people, like a human. And that was immediately met with hostility. I put my arms out to the side and took a couple of casual steps forward and asked if I could see a warrant before they continued to search my car, as I had not had an answer to that question the first time I asked it. And I was immediately grabbed by Randy Murr on my left and Tiffany Middleton on my right. And they immediately started to manufacture this scene, stop resisting, stop moving, just yelling, creating a disturbance. Ricky Nixon turns around and looks at me and says, "You don't have a license." And he began to just hit me in the face with a closed fist. And the way we were stationed along the side of the curb, Middleton was basically on the curb, so she tripped backwards. And instead of letting my arm go, she had my right arm. She pulled me down on top of her, in turn sandwiching me between her and Ricky Nixon and Randy Murr, who are still hitting me from behind. And while they're hitting me, the only thing I can do is lift my head. I lifted my head, and my gaze was met with the butt end of a radio, which she had been able to remove, and began to strike me as a weapon. And I knew it was bad after the first time she hit me. I could feel that she opened up my face. I could feel the blood starting to pour out of my face. My eye immediately swole closed. I couldn't see out of my right eye. And at this point, I was grabbed around the neck and hoisted backwards in a chokehold fashion. And an officer shouted out, "He's reaching for a gun, he's reaching for a gun." And all I could do was yell back, "No, I'm not reaching for anything." And this went out over the radio. So I forget what the symbol for the code is, but it's red and blue, lights and sirens. And we're roughly a block and a half from the District 6 police station. So some officers came on foot, some officers came in squad cars. They blocked off 16th and Washington, and they blocked off 16th and Emerson so no one could drive east or west, north or south. And at this point, I couldn't even count how many officers were responding. There were too many to count. I could hear my passenger in the background, my friend Addison, screaming, "What the hell are you doing? Why is this happening?" He comes from a small rural town in Midland, Texas. Never in his life would he have thought that he would witness such horrific treatment of any individual at the hands of police. And so, after I was hoisted backwards, Officer Randy Murr went around and took Tiffany Middleton's flashlight out of her holster and began to strike me an unknown number of times, as he referenced, in the head with it. This big police-issue mag flashlight, weighted at the end. And then I was thrown back to my face. Tiffany Middleton was no longer in this altercation. Other officers had come and removed her from the situation, so I was thrown onto my face. And at that point, I could just see boots. I could see officers handling me, and somebody screamed out, "If he doesn't calm down, he'll shoot him." And I remember an officer removing his pistol, and I can see his hand gripping the handle of the firearm. I can feel the cold steel pressed up against my temple. I can see his finger on the trigger, and I closed my eyes and I expected to be shot. And at that point, I lost consciousness. And when I awoke, it was like business as usual. These officers were laughing about what they had just done. I woke to being grabbed at the ankles and rolled out of the gutter. I had been maneuvered till I was in between my front tire and the curb, so I was face down in the gutter. And I was being drugged backwards across the grass and left to bleed on a police coat. While they were dragging me, one of the officers said, "You don't know how close you were to getting your fucking head blown off." And another officer said, "Where's that warrant now, you fucking nigger?" And they just let me bleed and faded and out of consciousness until the paramedics arrived. And when the paramedics arrived, I thought it was the police, so my first response was, don't hit me anymore, I don't think I can take it. And she said, "Relax, I'm a paramedic." And I said, "Why did they beat me so bad? I didn't do anything wrong." And the next thought that went through my head was, "I don't have insurance, I can't cover this, I need you to leave." And I'm telling the ambulance they need to pack up and go. And they were sitting there saying, "He's over 18, he doesn't want medical treatment, there's nothing we can do." So right before they left, I flagged them down, or I changed my mind. I was like, "No, you know what, let me get on the back of the stretcher." And I'm lucky I did that, because if I didn't, I wouldn't be here now. I would be dead. And so they put me on the stretcher, and they handcuffed my wrists, they handcuffed my ankles to the stretcher. Meanwhile, I'm bleeding profusely from my face. And she goes to clean me up, she goes to put gauze and pressure, and I stop her, and I tell her, "No, don't clean me up until somebody takes photos of this. Don't touch me, don't do anything." And after I said that, I started to go into shock. Started to get really cold. My hair started to stand up on my body. I began to shake violently. And it got to the point to where it was either, well, we stabilize you with an oxygen mask, or you might not even make it to the hospital. So they sent an accompanying officer with me, who was there witnessing the entire thing. And while I was stabilizing myself with this oxygen mask, she tried to put an IV in my arm. The paramedic did, and I told her, "No, I don't want any needles." And the officer who was accompanying me said, "Oh, he can take a beating, but he's scared to have a needle in his arm." What a pussy. So again, just reiterating the mentality of those officers. And they criminally charged me with I believe it was a level 4 felony, criminal intent to disarm a peace officer, punishable by prison time. And through this entire process, the most painful part of it, after they finally sent an officer in to take photos, after 45 stitches that it took to close up my face, after having a broken nose, a brain injury, and a concussion, the most painful part of this entire experience was seeing my mom when she came to visit me in the detention center. She didn't even know where I was. Nobody was surprised at the extent of my injuries at the hands of the police, inmates and sheriffs alike. The phones inside the jail don't necessarily contact and reach out to every cell phone number or landline. So I couldn't even, the numbers that I did know off the top of my head, were no good in the jail. They weren't accepting collect calls. So I had to convince one of the sheriffs that was working there to go against policy and call my mom on one of her off periods. Otherwise, I was going to sit there for who knew how long. And she did. She went against the policy and left my mom a short message. Just, I'm a Denver County Sheriff. Your son's in jail. You need to come see him. And that was it. So my mom finally came down to see me, and I hadn't seen my face. I didn't know how bad I looked. I know that in my mugshot, I was bleeding through my stitches. So it was quick, stitch me up, put me in the back of the paddy wagon, no special transportation, no ambulance, no fluids, none of that. Not when you're a criminal, not when you're now in custody, you're less than human. So we're going to send you in the paddy wagon with everyone else. In my mugshot, I was bleeding through my stitches, and when I saw my mom, she was mortified, became hysterical, and broke down and started to cry. She grabbed the strange woman next to her and turned her around and pointed at me and said, "Look at what they did to my son." And the most painful part about that was finally I had been desensitized from this beating to the jail, to the pictures, to not knowing time of day or even how bad my injuries were, to all of this crashing back down into reality when I saw my mom break down, and then having to send it immediately back to the side because now you have a minute and 30 seconds to relay very critical information, and then it's back to your cell. So in the midst of trying to control my mom, bring her back down, I'm sitting here telling her, "You need to look into the application for the public defender's office. I need you to tell Dad where this money is at so he can go talk to the bail bondsman and get me out of here. I need you to do this, that, and the other." And there is no I love you, there is no how are you doing, none of that. And then a minute, 30 seconds later, you're going back to your cell with the uncertainty of whether or not the information you just relayed was even digested to the point to be able to relay that to someone who knows. I know my passenger was taken to the District 6 police station where he was coerced into a false statement of events. The officers told him how to write it. They said that if you don't, we're going to charge you with the same things we charged him as, basically reiterating like you saw what we did to your friend, and if you don't want to be next, do what we say. And he took the bus 20 blocks in the wrong direction before he realized he was in Golden, trying to go to East Colfax. That's how disoriented he was. So I wasn't sure if my mom had been able to catch everything. I had told her no notepad, nothing. A couple of days went by, and then I was bailed out. She bailed me out, and I went immediately to Internal Affairs. And this was the entity responsible. This was the entity in place where, as community, you're supposed to be able to go to report police misconduct. I'm sitting here 19 years old. The majority of my face, black and purple, capillaries broken in my left eye, my right eye swollen shut. And I'm telling her what happened. And I'll never forget Virginia Quinones. Her response when I got to how they called me a nigger, she stopped the conversation and she said, wait, sometimes you need to own up to your actions as a man, and it's not always a good idea to play the race card. And then she went on some side tangent about how if I had tried to disarm her, she would have killed me. And it was at that point when I lost all trust for Internal Affairs and the internal investigation process. So this story goes and it goes and it continues to go, and it's been part of my catalyst into this movement, the activism, police accountability. Within 6 months, 2 of the same officers, Ricky Nixon and Randy Murr, were caught on video assaulting other members of our community in very high-profile cases, very high-profile fashion, because of how negligent the city was with my case. They closed it immediately. Before 3 months had gone by, my case was already closed. It was mishandled from the beginning. We found out, thanks to the attorneys who represented the women in the Denver Diner case, that in 2010, Internal Affairs was staffed by officers that were under investigation for patterns and practices of abuse. So it's no wonder why my case was mishandled and so many like it. But yes, I do want to pass the mic along, and that is kind of my personal narrative and background and into what has launched me into this much larger focus of activism.
Thank you, Alex. We've been listening to Alex Landau with a very powerful, I feel like I was there at the scene, not a pretty scene. But thanks for sharing your story as we were talking here on KGNU about police accountability. And so I'd like to pass the microphone down to Benjamin Donlin. And Benjamin comes at this topic from a little bit different perspective. Benjamin has been working on a homeless bill of rights, HB 15-1264. And so Benjamin, I'd like for you to explain a little bit more about your connection with the Homeless Bill of Rights and how your own story leads to this conversation. So welcome, Benjamin.
Thank you. So I'm black and Korean, and I was born in Florida and lived a pretty ordinary life till I was about 19. Had a few run-ins with things, but nothing serious, and I moved to Georgia, North Georgia specifically, and was there for about a year and got arrested around 6 times. A lot of that I placed on my own internal struggles of trying to exist in America, and I found a lot of faults that my parents sort of narrated to me for a long time. And so I sort of accepted a lot of that, but after the 6th time and they crushed my car to the 3rd impound, I just sort of became extremely disillusioned with the American narratives on race relations and how we're post-racial and things of that nature, and sort of hit the road more or less and started hitchhiking across the country and experiencing a lot of things that awakened me to a lot of new truths. eventually I ended up in Boulder because Boulder is a bit of a melting pot for travelers and such. And so I guess how it brings me into this conversation and how I got into homeless rights struggles would be I experienced a lot of these things myself, I guess. And I've been arrested around 12 times, repeatedly, not always based on racial prejudice, but or housing status, but most of the time it was. I had to run in here in Boulder about 5 years ago, where I was out behind the library, and I was just talking to some people out by the river, and there's some reconstruction going on, so cops showed up, like 3 of them, and they told us to get away from there. So I walked away, and they grabbed me as I was walking away. Like, hey, you look like a suspect. Black male with brown, blah, blah, blah. And just, I wasn't really paying attention. I didn't really care. I was like, dude, it's not me. I didn't do anything. And they started giving me the rundown, checking my pockets, what's my name, stuff like that. I didn't have any ID on me at the time. I was also on the streets and probably smelled really bad. So I don't know why they grabbed me. But so after that, initially, I mean, I wasn't very responsive. I sort of just started cussing at them and stuff, you know, and so they all tackled me and threw me to the ground. I asked for a supervisor. The supervisor come out. He came out and sort of alleviated the situation, said it wasn't me, and it all went away. They kind of, you know, punched me a few times. I really, you know, so I don't know. I used to like the police. I used to really want to be a detective, and I used to admire the idea of like investigatory work and sleuthing out mysteries and murders and who did that and such things. And over the course of like living, breathing, the police came to me and convinced me to not like them. And it took a while, but now I'm not a fan. And I see there's a lot of systematic problems that is linked to the structure of our governance that is causing a lot of these prejudices to become more widespread and rampant. And they've always sort of been there, but it's getting worse and worse. And one of these sort of things is the way they deal with the homeless. And over the last 20-ish years, I guess to give a bit of a background, Ronald Reagan, the great president that he was, decided to slash federal funding for housing development projects and completely annihilated the low-income housing, which has caused exponential rises in homelessness over the last 30 years. Over the last 15-ish years, business improvement districts have been readily and heartily lobbying on city councils to push sort of like criminalization efforts surrounding people experiencing poverty. A lot of that falls on the homeless. And so where we're at now is that these laws are still being promoted, still being orchestrated at a faster rate than they were initially. And it's causing an even greater rise in homelessness, compounded with the fact of the lack of federal funding, as people can't escape the cycle of it because they, if anybody became homeless from rising rent rates or foreclosures or lack of job markets, the moment they start trying to sleep outside, or since there's not enough shelter capacity, they're liable to arrest. And upon arrest, if they had acquired a job at any point or had any kind of housing, a lot of that is lost. And so they have to restart and then try to acquire housing, try to acquire a job, and then get arrested. And so it just sort of cycles back and forth, keeping people trapped in a sort of situation that is nearly unescapable without connections, really. So what I work on with the group known as Denver Homeless Out Loud is a bill called a Homeless Bill of Rights. And the idea is to stop a very basic criminalization efforts being promoted around the state of Colorado, in that cities are legalizing the ability to sleep outside. And so what the bill does is it decriminalizes sleeping outside and decriminalizes sleeping in cars, which a fair amount of people still do. And sort of opens a pathway for people to share and receive food and parks, since there's a lot of controversy around that in the South, where they're currently legislating these bans on food sharing and parks, which is what it is. So it's trying to like open a pathway to. It's not the ultimate solution. I mean, the ultimate solution is very simply just housing, but it will hopefully open a pathway up to the ability to get housing and the ability to maintain a job, even if you have to sleep out in the streets. And yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Again, we're having a conversation about police accountability, and heard some great personal anecdotes from Benjamin and Alex and Darren. But really, it's a broader topic than that. And I think, before we get to our last panelist here, as I think about the subject matter at hand, from a bigger picture, the common thread in most of these contentious and systemic social struggles is the abuse of power. And people in power tend to use their power to consolidate their power. And the best way to do that is to disempower others. And I think many of the same dynamics that we see in situations, for example, like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, our present conflicts between police and minority groups in poor neighborhoods, and also playing out in the struggle between traditional culture and gay minorities. And the reality is, if you're part of the dominant group, you have greater access to abusive actions that can be postured as peaceful, rational, or necessary. And if you're in the less dominant group, you don't have the same access to legitimate power. So the temptation is always there to succumb to more vulgar displays of violence, and oftentimes those who feel disempowered succumb to that temptation. And I think it is also often the case that those with the upper hand can actually entice those behaviors, because it gives legitimacy to the need for the dominant group to maintain control. So those are some of the subject matters we're talking about on a broader level, not just the particularities of incidences such as Alex explained in his own personal story. But I want to just kind of finish out the panel by introducing Whitney Leeds. Whitney works with Communities United Against Mass Incarceration. And so, Whitney, I'd really love for you to kind of just take us back up to 36,000 feet and kind of talk about, hearing these stories and kind of not just the anecdotes, but kind of the systemic issues. What are some solutions? What are some perspectives that would help us as a community engage in more helpful dialogue and solutions around this? So, thanks for being here, Whitney.
Sure, thank you. And forgive me, y'all. I'm going to be using my cell phone for notes. I'm not texting. So I really come to this having experienced things in sort of a secondhand way. I spent 4.5 years in Harlem, New York City, and while I was there, I saw a world of police brutality. I also saw brutality by other government agents, such as immigration officials. I regularly saw kids getting beat up by the cops. Stop and frisk was a daily reality. I saw a neighbor of mine literally getting pulled from the arms of his children by immigration officials, and so having that sort of up close and personal experience really planted in me a sense of urgency that I couldn't ignore. And that's why sort of, I think some people wonder, like, you're a white person, this doesn't impact you. It very much does impact us as white people, and I think because white people actually benefit from these things, it's our duty to come out against it. And so each of you listeners, I am tasking you to find a way to get involved with this movement. So that being said, I work with Communities United Against Mass Incarceration. Our acronym is QAMI, so I'll refer to it as QAMI moving forward. We have a number of different campaigns that we work on, but basically, to give you sort of an understanding of the way that we look at this issue, police accountability and police brutality is sort of one piece of a much bigger puzzle, a system-wide puzzle. And if you sort of think about all of the people that are in some manner under the supervision of the criminal justice system, whether it be in jails or prison or on probation or parole, or they're in immigrant detention center, if you think about the reasons why they're there, and I mean, not the convictions, I'm talking about the root causes of why they're there. People are there for crimes of poverty or homelessness. People are there because of untreated mental health issues, because of untreated addiction issues. People are there because we have a really racist immigration system. People are there because they're wrongfully convicted of crimes that they didn't commit, because we frankly have juries that have implicit bias and are unaware of their implicit biases. If you're unaware of your implicit bias, go look up the Harvard implicit bias study. Take it, and I promise, if you don't think that you're racist, I promise you are. People are in the criminal justice system for all of these reasons, and yet our criminal justice system doesn't actually deal with the root causes of these problems. System-wide, we don't have, and I forget to mention there are a number of different reasons also. That's not the entire pie chart. Other reasons are, people are abused and neglected as children, then it manifests as violence when they're adults, for example. There's a good chunk of people that are there because they made a stupid mistake. And then there's a good little tiny slice that's there for white collar crime. But one of these issues has a solution, and one of those actually involve putting people in cages. And actually, for every single one of those issues, putting somebody in a cage makes it worse. It causes that problem to fester. So what Kwame tries to do is to bring together all those organizations and individuals in Colorado that are working on issues of mass incarceration, be it issues that are impacted by mass incarceration or that impact mass incarceration, and really trying to deal with those root causes. So strengthening the institutions that provide affordable and accessible mental health and addiction options, treatment rather, supporting efforts like those that Benjamin is working on, along with Denver Homeless Out Loud, to actually widen the current crop of housing that's available to people. One of the things that we're working on as well through Kwame is what we call the Policing the Police Task Force, which really started right around when Ferguson really exploded. Folks in Denver came together. There were a lot of protests and solidarity, and people came together for a community forum to try and figure out how we can turn this collective energy into action. And what came out of that was that people basically, there was one driving feeling out of that community forum, which was that we don't trust police officers, clearly, and the police accountability mechanisms that currently exist simply don't work. Right, so Alex Landau spoke about the Internal Affairs Bureau. The Internal Affairs Bureau is within the police department. The police that are on the Internal Affairs Bureau are there on a rotating basis. On any other day, they may be a beat cop or on the traffic unit, or they may be on the SWAT unit. And so they're highly biased individuals. We have an independent monitor who's appointed by the mayor, but he's not able to do his own investigations. He basically receives the investigations that Internal Affairs does, and he tries to be persuasive, make recommendations, but he doesn't have any teeth. And so what we see is time and time again in cases like Alex's, in cases like the people who were brutalized in the Denver diner, Jesse Hernandez, who was just killed January 26th, Ryan Ronquillo, who was killed last July, Sherrod Kendall, who was brutally assaulted and then left basically to die in the jail. We see time and time again that these are supposedly being investigated by Internal Affairs, and then we never hear from them again. And so really what the Police and the Police Task Force is trying to do is to actually strengthen the accountability mechanisms in Denver. That won't solve the problem though. We are looking for people who are interested in helping out, and I know that also the Colorado Progressive Coalition that Alex Landau works out is also doing police accountability work, so if you're interested, please seek out the Colorado Progressive Coalition for that work. You can also find us, we're at cuami.org, cuami.org. But I also want to talk about this in a little bit broader of a way. In some ways, the police are an entryway, obviously, into the system of mass incarceration. But in other ways, they're also a smokescreen. They take a lot of heat because they are the first line of defense and offense, really, depending on how you look at it. But beyond that, people get brutalized at really every major juncture of the criminal justice system. It's just less visible, right? Because when it happens to the police, it happens in the community. When it happens in the jails or in the prisons or in the criminal justice system, it's more hidden, and in some ways more insidious as well. And so I also want to talk about the district attorney's office. Now, the district attorney's office have the opportunity, and some would say the duty, to effectuate justice. And sometimes that means charging a police officer with a crime. But as you heard before, in Denver, police officers never get charged with crimes. And actually, the last police officer that was charged with a crime 23 years ago, he was charged with sex assault against somebody that didn't even occur on the job. It wasn't even really job related. And the district attorney's office have complete control over charging decisions. They have control over plea negotiations, and you heard how 95% of people will take a plea deal in order to avoid worse consequences. They are able to make arguments as to sentencing, and because most judges are former district attorneys, they almost always go with what the district attorney says. And so, although a lot of pressure is mounted towards the police because they have this visible presence and because they're literally the ones with the guns, with the batons, we actually don't really see what's going on behind that smokescreen, which is what's going on in the district attorney's office. It's what's going on with the judges. And I would really encourage folks to think a lot more critically about, for example, especially here in Colorado, local elections. We elect our district attorneys. You have the ability to lobby your district attorney, to tell the district attorney, when a cop kills a kid who is unarmed, you need to prosecute them. You spend all your time putting poor people and people of color in prison, not giving them the resources that they need to actually survive and live a real life. And for people like police officers, there's total impunity. So if we want to talk about police accountability, and we should get used to talking about it, and we should get used to talking about how race is involved with this, and how white privilege is involved with this, we also need to be talking about the other individuals who are to blame in this system as well. The police can only go so far policing themselves. Other than that, it's up to us. So I will leave you with that. I said before, folks should get involved. You don't have to get involved through Denver Homeless Out Loud or the Colorado Progressive Coalition or Colorado Foreclosure Resistance Coalition or Kwame, but get involved somehow. This is one of those issues that we simply can't sit on our hands. This is continuing to get worse. We see it worsen every day. And it's our duty, it's our responsibility to take responsibility for it. So thank you.
So with that, Whitney, I'd love for you, and I want to just kind of go back in this direction. Could you just repeat for our audience, if they want to get contacted with Kwame or any other organization you work with, how would they reach out to you?
Sure, so in order to get in touch with Kwame, and you can also, if you're interested in the police and the police task force, which is really based in Denver, you can also get in touch with us through that. Our website is cuami.org, www.cuami.org. We also have an email address. It's COMI Coalition, so Colorado Mass Incarceration Coalition @gmail.com.
And Benjamin, if folks want to get involved or hear more about the Homeless Bill of Rights?
Yeah, so we have a website as well. It's denverhomelessoutloud.org. And our email is info@denverhomelessoutloud.org as well. And but we work on multiple issues. One of them is building tiny houses in Denver for the homeless. So if you're interested in just building houses on the weekend, it's a really fun activity. It builds community. It's good for the spirits. We also work on the Homeless Bill of Rights and advocating for urban rest stops and more public bathrooms in the city. And we also have a paper that we receive stories from the homeless in Denver, and we simply edit it and give it back out for free. But the editing process is purely volunteer basis, and we could always use more volunteers. So please, if you're interested, get involved. It's all based in Denver, and it's good stuff.
All right, and Alex, how can we connect with Colorado Progressive Coalition?
You can check us out on our website. That's www.progressivecoalition.org. You can also email me directly at Alex. It's alex@progressivecoalition.org. Or you can just, and our office is on 700 Calumet, so you're more than welcome to stop by the office. We're actually having, on April 15th, we're going to be collaborating with other organizations, Jobs with Justice, SEIU, AFSC, and some other predominantly labor division style working groups who have been at the forefront of Fight for 15. And on April 15th, we'll be gathering at the Tivoli Commons on Auraria campus. It's in between the Tivoli. There's a bus stop, and then the physical education department's right there. It's like in the middle of all of that. We're going to be gathering at 5 p.m. Step off is about 6:30, depending on when folks kind of fill that space. And we're going to march. We're going to march in solidarity with underwaged workers. This is an effort to raise minimum wage to $15 an hour plus a union for folks who aren't unionized. This will be the largest movement to take place in the country around raising minimum wage. It's going to be happening in over 20 other states as well, and we're going to be occupying a fast food establishment there in the area after we march from the campus up Spear and back down Colfax. So I encourage folks, if you do have some availability on April 15th, that's a Wednesday, I know, to meet us at Auraria campus at 5 p.m. in front of the Tivoli.
And lastly, Darren, how can folks get in touch with you?
Couple ways: foreclosureresistance@gmail.com reaches me and others if you need help with that, or if you just need to reach me. You can also just call me, 720-961-3869. And like Alex, I want to share that next weekend, Sunday, April 12th, at Coffee at the Point at East 26th in Welton, we're going to be meeting with one of the commanders of the Denver Police Department and others who have had experiences like or worse than Alex himself. Alex will be there, and we're going to engage on a discussion with Denver PD about how we can make things better. So I hope you'll come to that. Thanks.
And again, for our listeners, I'm Ken Miller with the Collaborative Community Radio Show here on KGNU Denver Boulder, and we've been having a panel discussion on police accountability with Whitney Leeds from the Communities United Against Mass Incarceration, Alex Landau from Colorado Progressive Coalition, Benjamin Donlin of the Homeless Bill of Rights group working with that Bill of Rights, and Darren O'Connor, who's an activist, works with Radically Compassionate Justice and Boulder Rights Watch. And at this time, we want to open it up to our live audience here and have some questions and comments for our panelists. And so if you wouldn't mind just please coming up to this microphone with your questions, and please introduce